Episode 95, titled Vulnerability Patterns, Misconfig, Legacy ACLs, Insecure Protocols, Patch Gaps, we frame vulnerabilities as predictable patterns rather than surprises because most real-world exposure comes from repeatable human and process failure modes. The exam often rewards pattern recognition, where you can look at a symptom and quickly infer the likely root category instead of chasing exotic explanations. In hybrid and cloud-connected networks, complexity creates many places where small mistakes can become large vulnerabilities, but the same kinds of mistakes tend to recur across organizations. When you learn these patterns, you stop thinking of vulnerabilities as bad luck and start treating them as operational debt that can be managed through discipline. That mindset is powerful because it moves you from reactive patching and firefighting to preventative control through review cycles and inventory hygiene. Before we continue, a quick note: this audio course is a companion to the CloudNetX books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. Misconfiguration is the most common cause of exposure and outages because it is easy to create, hard to notice, and often introduced by well-intentioned changes under time pressure. A single permissive rule, a default setting left untouched, or a misapplied identity policy can expose services publicly or remove segmentation that was assumed to exist. Misconfiguration also creates outages when dependencies are changed without understanding, such as routing adjustments that break reachability or security controls that block required traffic. The reason misconfiguration is so common is that environments evolve constantly, and configuration is the language of that evolution, meaning there are always opportunities for drift and mismatch. The exam tends to emphasize this because preventing misconfiguration is less about buying new tools and more about implementing repeatable practices that reduce error rates. When you treat misconfiguration as your default suspect, you improve both detection and prevention because you look first at what changed and what assumptions broke. Legacy access control lists, often shortened to ACLs after first mention, are a classic vulnerability pattern because they linger long after their original purpose is forgotten. These rules often begin as temporary exceptions, such as allowing a partner network, supporting a migration, or bypassing a failing dependency during an incident. Over time, the environment changes, the need disappears, but the rule remains, quietly granting access that no longer has a business justification. Legacy access control lists are dangerous because they are rarely revisited and they often live in places like firewalls, routers, security groups, and endpoint policies where they can create unintended pathways across trust boundaries. The exam expects you to recognize that old rules are not neutral because they expand the attack surface and can undermine segmentation, especially when combined with other changes like new services and new identities. When you audit legacy access control lists, you are not only tightening security, you are also simplifying the environment, which improves reliability and incident response clarity. Insecure protocols are another predictable pattern because they expose credentials, allow downgrade attacks, or provide weak protection that attackers can exploit without sophisticated tooling. Clear-text authentication protocols leak passwords and tokens to any on-path observer, turning shared networks and compromised routers into credential harvesting points. Downgrade attacks occur when systems allow fallback to weaker versions of protocols or ciphers, enabling an attacker to force a session into a less secure mode that is easier to intercept or manipulate. Some insecure protocols persist because they are good enough in isolated lab networks, or because legacy devices require them, and then they are accidentally carried forward into production. The exam framing often pushes you to see protocol choices as security decisions, not simply compatibility decisions, because the protocol determines what an attacker can observe and influence in transit. When you eliminate insecure protocols and enforce strong versions, you remove entire classes of attack that would otherwise remain available. Patch gaps are predictable because patching is operationally hard, and hard tasks tend to be deferred until an attacker makes the urgency obvious. A patch gap exists when known flaws remain unpatched in systems that are reachable or valuable, which creates a window where attackers can use public exploit knowledge to gain access. Patch gaps become more dangerous when inventory is incomplete, because untracked assets often remain unpatched indefinitely, especially in network infrastructure, where devices are assumed stable and rarely revisited. The exam tends to emphasize that patching is not only about applying updates, but about managing exposure, prioritizing high-risk flaws, and ensuring coverage across all relevant systems. Patch gaps also include firmware and appliance software, not just operating systems, because network devices and security appliances are frequent targets and can provide high-privilege footholds. When patch gaps are managed through a routine cycle, the attacker's advantage shrinks because the easiest known exploits stop working reliably. Configuration reviews and baselines are practical ways to catch drift because they create a comparison point between intended state and actual state. Configuration reviews can be scheduled, peer-reviewed, and tied to change records, ensuring that changes are justified and that temporary exceptions are not silently promoted into permanent exposure. Baselines provide a snapshot of expected configuration and behavior, making it easier to detect when a rule set, protocol setting, or routing policy has changed in a way that does not match the plan. Drift is dangerous because it accumulates slowly, and each small deviation can interact with others, creating a vulnerability that nobody explicitly chose. The exam expects you to recognize that drift detection is a key operational control because most environments do not fail from one dramatic mistake, but from a series of small changes that gradually erode safety margins. When review cycles and baselines are in place, you can catch misconfiguration before it becomes an incident and catch legacy access controls before they become a breach path. Inventory is the foundation because you cannot patch or harden unknown assets, and unknown assets are the places where attackers often find the easiest wins. Inventory includes what exists, where it lives, who owns it, what software and firmware it runs, and what services it exposes, because each of those facts affects your ability to manage risk. In hybrid environments, inventory must span cloud accounts, on-premises devices, endpoints, and managed services, because attackers move across boundaries and will take any available foothold. Without inventory, patch programs become incomplete by definition, and configuration reviews become selective, meaning you may secure the visible assets while the forgotten ones remain wide open. The exam often frames this as a basic governance truth. Asset visibility precedes asset security. When inventory is accurate, every other control becomes more effective because you can target actions, measure coverage, and prove improvement over time. A scenario makes these patterns tangible. So consider an old firewall rule that permits broad outbound traffic from a sensitive segment, originally created to support a migration or troubleshooting effort. Over time, the segment begins to host more sensitive systems, and the broad egress rule becomes a silent exfiltration pathway that an attacker can exploit after compromising a host. If a compromised endpoint can reach any destination over common protocols, the attacker can upload data to external services, use command and control channels freely, and pivot without being forced through monitored choke points. The rule may not look obviously wrong to someone skimming a rule set because broad egress is common, but its risk depends heavily on where it applies and what it was meant to enable. In this scenario, the vulnerability is not a software flaw. It is a legacy access control decision that outlived its purpose. The exam expects you to see that misconfiguration and legacy rules can create the same outcome as a technical exploit, which is unauthorized access and data movement. Emergency changes that are never cleaned up afterward are a consistent pitfall because emergencies encourage exceptions, and exceptions become permanent when nobody owns the cleanup. During incidents, teams may open ports, relax access controls, disable validation checks, or bypass filters to restore service quickly, and those actions can be justified in the moment when uptime is threatened. The problem comes later when the emergency is over, the change is forgotten, and the environment continues operating with weakened controls. This pitfall is dangerous because it creates a false sense of normal, where the weakened state becomes the new baseline without conscious acceptance of the risk. The exam framing often connects this to change management discipline, where temporary changes should have explicit expiration, follow-up review, and documented rollback to the secure configuration. When cleanup is built into the process, emergencies stop creating long-term security debt. Treating network gear as set-and-forget infrastructure is another pitfall, because it assumes that stable devices remain safe without ongoing attention, which is not true in modern threat environments. Network devices run software, have vulnerabilities, and implement policies that shape every traffic path, so drift and patch gaps in network gear can have outsized impact. Set-and-forget thinking also leads to inconsistent logging, outdated cryptographic settings, and legacy access control lists that nobody remembers how to interpret, which increases both security risk and operational fragility. Attackers target network gear because it can provide persistence, visibility, and traffic control, and because it is often less monitored than endpoints and servers. The exam expects you to recognize that infrastructure devices are part of the attack surface and must be maintained like any other system. When network gear is maintained through patch windows and configuration review cycles, it becomes less attractive as a target and less likely to become an accidental vulnerability source. Quick wins that reduce these vulnerability patterns include scheduling review cycles, disabling unused services, and establishing predictable patch windows, because these actions build routine discipline. Scheduled reviews ensure misconfigurations, and legacy access control lists are periodically evaluated against current requirements, making it harder for drift to accumulate unnoticed. Disabling unused services reduces the attack surface directly by removing listening ports and legacy protocol endpoints that attackers can probe and exploit. Patch windows create a predictable operational rhythm where updates are expected, tested, and applied, which reduces patch gaps and avoids the chaos of emergency patching under threat pressure. The exam usually favors these quick wins because they are sustainable and because they address root causes rather than symptoms. When you build routine, you reduce the reliance on heroics, which is exactly how environments become both safer and easier to operate. A useful memory anchor for this episode is config, legacy, protocol, patch, review cycle, because it captures the common categories of weakness and the habit that keeps them under control. Config reminds you to suspect misconfiguration first and to treat configuration as a living control surface. Legacy reminds you that old access control lists and exceptions often outlive their purpose and should be actively pruned. Protocol reminds you that insecure protocols and downgrade paths are recurring vulnerabilities that expose credentials and weaken trust. Patch reminds you that known flaws remain exploitable until updates close them, especially in infrastructure and appliances. Review cycle ties it all together, because consistent reviews are what prevent drift, discover unknown exposure, and keep defenses aligned with reality as the environment changes. A prompt-style exercise that reinforces exam pattern recognition is identifying the vulnerability type from a described symptom, because symptoms often map cleanly to one of these categories. If the symptom is unexpected public exposure or sudden access where none should exist, misconfiguration is a strong candidate, especially if a recent change occurred. If the symptom is unexpected connectivity that appears to come from old rules or undocumented exceptions, legacy access control lists are likely involved. If the symptom includes credential capture risk, protocol downgrade behavior, or clear text transmission indicators, insecure protocols are the likely root pattern. If the symptom aligns with exploitation of a known issue or compromise of an unpatched device, patch gaps are the likely category, especially when the affected asset is old or rarely maintained. Practicing this mapping builds speed and clarity, which is exactly what the exam is trying to measure with scenario questions. Episode 95 concludes with the idea that the most dangerous vulnerabilities are often the most predictable because they come from repeatable patterns like misconfiguration, legacy access control drift, insecure protocol exposure, and patch gaps. These patterns persist when review cycles are weak, inventory is incomplete, and emergency exceptions become permanent, so the defense is built on disciplined operations rather than on one-time cleanup efforts. Configuration reviews and baselines catch drift. Inventory ensures nothing is forgotten, and routine patching and service hardening reduce the available attack surface. The configuration audit rehearsal assignment is to take one real or representative segment, review its access controls, identify any legacy rules and insecure protocols, and verify that patch coverage is current for the devices that enforce those rules. When you can do that audit methodically, you are demonstrating the exam-level skill of turning symptoms into vulnerability categories and turning categories into sustainable control practices. With that mindset, vulnerabilities stop being surprises and become managed risk patterns that you can steadily reduce. Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.